All right, so we're going to continue on with the movements of the wrist and the hand. The primary movement we discussed in the last lecture that happens in the joints of the wrist. What is that called? Well, it's called gliding, right? That's what gives us the condyloid joint that we have at the wrist. So when we combine the gliding movements together, we create those four movements that actually happen at the wrist. Flexion and extension are words you've heard before, obviously, and they happen again in anatomical position. So flexion would be bringing the palm of your hand towards your forearm, and that happens at the radiocarpal joint. So that's between the radius and the scaphoid and lunate. Extension happens at the midcarpal joint, and that would be from anatomical position, bringing your hand backward towards the dorsal side of your forearm. Okay, so just remember that flexion is the radiocarpal joints, extension is the midcarpal joints. The other two movements are new terms that you don't know. It should make sense. Basically, I'm moving towards one of the bones. So if I ulnar deviate my hand, I'm going to take my hand and I'm going to lean it towards the pinky side, just like she's doing down here. And if I'm going to radial deviate, I'm going to move my thumb towards the radius. Okay, you're going to see that you're going to have a lot more movement in ulnar deviation than you do in radial deviation. That's because of the way the bones are. So it's just like in the foot, how you can invert the foot more than you evert it. Exactly the same in the wrists and hands. So there's a lot of similarities that overlap. What about if we talk about your metacarpal phalangeal, pips and dips? What do all of those joints do? Well, they all can do flexion and extension. So they're technically kind of a hinge joint. They just flex and extend, that's it, okay? But the metacarpal phalangeal joints can also do abduction and adduction. So that's how you can take your finger and kind of spin it in a circle. Because of the shape of the end of the metacarpal, that allows you to do those additional movements. The thumb can do those four things, but it can also do one extra thing, which is called opposition. And opposition means that you're touching your thumb to your fingertip. So if you've heard, oh, humans and primates are the only animals that have the opposable thumb, right? Your dog doesn't have an opposable thumb. It can't pinch something and pick it up. So that's something that makes us unique in the ability to be able to perform opposition with the thumb. And again, that saddle joint is what allows that to happen. All right, so if I'm trying to create these movements, it can be a little confusing with the thumb. So again, from anatomical position, if I'm going to flex my thumb, I'm going to bring it forward in the sagittal plane towards the palm. Okay, and if I'm going to extend it, I'm going to pull it back in the sagittal plane towards the back of my hand. Abduction and adduction is if I adduct my thumb, I'm going to bring it right up next to my palm, and if I abduct it, I'm going to stick it out away from my palm a little further. Okay, so hopefully those make sense. Then another word you would want to know is that ability to do opposition. We call that grasping motion prehension. So you have a prehensile thumb, you can perform prehension. Just another word to throw in there. All right, muscles. There's a lot of them, just warning you, and they have long names. So hang in there with me. I'll try to identify which ones are the most important. A lot of our wrist muscles actually originate above or at the elbow joint. So even though they cross the elbow, they don't really act on the elbow, and that's why we didn't talk about them when we were doing the elbow unit. But they're going to come up now. So what do we call a muscle that originates outside of a structure and inserts onto it? We had this in the foot as well. They were called extrinsic muscles. So that's what we're going to talk about first. On the anterior side of the arm, that is, again, an anatomical position, the side that your palm is on, that side. All right, so what I'm going to focus on here is look at the commonality. So we've got all these four starting from the common flexor tendon. What is the common flexor tendon? It's an insertion spot on the medial side of your elbow. So if you take your wrist right now, you take your hand and flex it, you'll feel right around your elbow a little muscle part kind of bulge up because you're activating those muscles. That is just distal to the medial epicondyle of the elbow. And that's where your common flexor tendon is. So all four of these muscles, your flexor carpi radialis, flexor carpi ulnaris, flexor digitorum superficialis, and palmaris longus, they all start from that one spot, okay? And they have different insertions. So flexor carpi ulnaris flexor carpi radialis should make sense. Starting from there, it's going to go down to the second and third metacarpals. It's going to flex and radial deviate the wrist. So again, most important thing to me with muscles is that you understand what they do. All right, so that's what the flexor carpi radialis does. Flexor carpi ulnaris, just the opposite, flexion and ulnar deviation. So that's going to attach more on the pinky side. Flexor digitorum, again, digits meaning fingers, it's going to split actually into 4 tendons, okay, and then split again and go on either side of the bases of the 4 fingers. So it does flex the wrist, which is why we're talking about it here. It also flexes your MCP joints and your PIP joints, okay, but it does not go all the way down to the dip joints. We have a different muscle that does that. Palmaris longus starts in the common flexor tendon, goes to your palmar aponeurosis. I'm not sure if you remember that word, but an aponeurosis is a big flat tendon. So on the palm of your hand, there's a big flat tendon that covers all the stuff that's going on in the hand. So this is going to attach and insert right into that. And it flexes the wrist, but it also tightens that fascia. So that's an important muscle to remember. The flexor digitorum profundus, okay, this is a deeper muscle. It's going to start on the proximal portion of the ulna, so a little bit more distally than the common flexor tendon. Just like the superficialis divides into 4, okay, it goes through the carpal tunnel and then splits and goes to all 4 fingers. This one is the one that acts on those dip joints. So that's why we have 2 different muscles going to the fingers. So if you look here, this is going to be the anterior side of your muscle. Common flexor tendon up here. Here's your flexor carpi radialis coming down to this side. Flexor carpi ulnaris on this side. Okay, a flexor retinaculum here, and you can see them all passing under there like I mentioned in the last lecture. And then here's your tendons of the flexor digitorum superficialis, that's the less deep one. And here's the tendons of the, oh, they don't have the profundus on here. Well, they would be more down in the dip joints here. But you can again just see how many muscles are associated with the wrists that are starting way up by the elbow. If you want to find your flexor digitorum superficialis, just flex your wrist and bring it into a flex position, and you'll see it kind of pop out right along here. And palmaris longus, it should be right in the middle of your wrist, kind of a long tendon that will pop out again if you make a fist and flex your wrist. And then the flexor carpi ulnaris, you'll see it on the ulnar side if you flex and kind of deviate in that direction. It's a pretty good sized muscle. Okay, there's about 22 muscles in your forearm, so they're all working hard to get these hand motions going. Flexor carpi radialis, there it is. Okay, of the 5 anterior muscles, 4 of them start on the medial epicondyle. What is that place called that they start? Common flexor tendon. And which of these muscles goes above the flexor retinaculum? It was in the chart, but I didn't point it out yet. See if you caught that. Okay, palmaris longus. That is an important one because you can see that guy going all the way into that palmar aponeurosis. So it does not go into the carpal tunnel. It's the only one that goes above. It's also not present in 20% of people, strangely. And sometimes we use it for surgical procedures. It's really just an assisting muscle or a synergist, okay? It's not a prime flexor of the wrist, so if you don't have it, no big deal. The way you can tell if you have it or not is if you flex your wrist and then, well, make a fist and then flex your wrist. If you don't see 2 tendons popping up, you only see 1, you probably don't have your palmaris longus. And that's the tendon that we use for that Tommy John surgery in the elbow, which is a UCL repair. Okay, posterior muscles. Long names again. We have now a common extensor tendon. Okay, so both the common flexor and common extensor have 4 muscles attaching to them. So we have extensor carpi radialis brevis, extensor carpi ulnaris, extensor digitorum, and extensor digiti minimi. You know, I love that name. So those four are all starting from the common extensor tendon, and then they go down to create, again, the movement we talk about. So carpi radialis brevis is going to do extension and radial deviation. Carpi ulnaris, extension and ulnar deviation. Extensor digitorum is going to extend the wrist and the fingers. Extensor digiti minimi goes only to your fifth finger. So it does affect wrist extension, but it's also very active in extending your pinky. And you can actually see it if you really extend your pinky kind of hard, you'll see it popping out on that pinky side. And then your extensor carpi radialis longus comes from even higher up. This is originating on the humerus. So this is a very long muscle. And what it does is go all the way down and radial deviate the wrist, just like the brevis, but it's a much longer muscle. Extensor indicis goes to your index finger, your pointer finger, and that also is starting on the ulna, but it's not at the common extensor tendon, so it's separate, and it's going to do extension of those MCP joints and in the first finger and assist in wrist extension. So what is the structure known for the posterior muscles? It is called the common extensor tendon. And here's a bunch of them that you can see. These pictures, again, are really good, so you can kind of identify what's going on. We've got the extensor carpi radialis longus coming all the way from the humerus down here. We have extensor carpi radialis brevis. We haven't not talked about the thumb muscles yet, but those are all thumb muscles. Extensor digitorum, extensor carpi ulnaris, extensor indicis, and there's your retinaculum, and we'll get to these hand muscles in a minute. If you want to see them on yourself, just make that fist and extend your wrist. You'll see the extensor carpi radialis longus and brevis popping up on the posterior side. They run pretty close to each other, so they're usually easy to palpate. Extensor carpi ulnaris, I find this one very easy to palpate. It pops out pretty good. So you can see that one. There's another just picture so you can kind of see how substantial the muscle bellies are. There's your extensor digitorum. I'm sure you've seen this on your hand before with those tendons coming out when you extend your fingers. And when you rock on like this guy, you will see that extensor digiti minimi popping out on the back of the hand. And there's your extensor indicis. So it's actually starting further down. Your common extensor tendon is going to be way up here. So this is just starting very low down in the ulna and coming up to that second finger, pointer finger. Okay, intrinsic muscles of the hand. These start and end in your hand. There are a ton of them again. All I want you to know is, what does it do? So abductor digiti minimi, what does it do? It abducts the fifth MCP joint. It abducts your pinky. Okay, what does the flexor digiti minimi brevis do? Flexes the fifth finger. What does the opponents do? It helps that pinky touch the thumb. Okay, so kind of that sort of thing. I mean, this information is great, and if you can learn it, more power to you. You're going to use it in college, but I'm not going to test you on it right now. It's more for your reference. Okay, we have interossei. Those are going in between the carpal or metacarpal bones and just performing abduction and adduction of the fingers. So that's where that movement comes from. And then if you remember, we had these in the foot as well, the lumbricals. Only muscle I know of that does not actually attach to a bone. They go from one tendon to another tendon, and they are just assisting with flexion and extension of the pips and dips. So here's the little guys. Dorsal interossei, okay, palmar look a little different. These look kind of like Christmas trees, I guess. And here's your pinky. So you've got your abductor digiti minimi, you've got your flexor digiti minimi, and then you've got your opponens, which is a bigger muscle. And when you put those together, you get a structure called your hypothenar eminence. So if you take your pinky right now and you sort of flex it towards your palm, you'll see this area of your palm sort of flex out, kind of a, it's just a bunch of muscles connected together, but it's called hypothenar. Here's just a few more. Thenar eminence is going to be your thumb, so we'll get to that. Your lumbricals are in here, from tendon to tendon. So there's your hypothenar eminence, okay? So I just told you the answer to this. 3 of the muscles make up an anatomical structure involved in the movement of the little finger. That is your hypothenar eminence. Hypothenar. And the other 3 muscles we talked about are moving the other fingers. Okay, so the hypothenar muscles are only for the pinky. The other 3 muscles are for the other fingers to do abduction, adduction. Okay, 2 of the dorsal interossei will attach to the lateral part of the phalanges, but the other 2 attach to the medial part. And 2 of the palmar kind of do the same thing. So they're really interesting muscles, again, a little beyond what we're getting at, but just take a look at the drawings of those, because when you do that abduction and adduction, again, there's a finger that technically doesn't move. It doesn't mean that you can't move it, but go ahead and open your hand up and then put it back. Which finger stays stationary? It's going to be your 3rd finger, your middle finger. So in your foot, the middle of the foot was the 2nd toe, but in your hand, the middle is the 3rd finger. Okay, so there's a picture of abduction, adduction, and then flexion and extension of the MCPs. All right, then we've got the extrinsic muscles of the thumb, and there's 4 of them, okay? 2 from the ulna, 2 from the radius. Pollex, P-O-L-L-E-X, is the Latin word for the thumb. If you remember, when we talked about the foot, hallux was the Latin word for the big toe. So we have hallux in the toe, pollex in the wrist, okay? So extensor pollicis longus, going to extend the thumb, okay? It also helps with radial deviation. Extensor pollicis brevis also does extension, also does radial deviation. So those are basically the same. Then you have your abductor pollicis longus, which is going to abduct that first metacarpal, okay, and assist with radial deviation. And then flexor pollicis longus is going to flex and assist with wrist flexion. So just kind of understand those actions. Here's a picture. You got your extensor there, abductor, and here's extensor pollicis longus going all the way to that distal phalange. And extensor pollicis brevis coming here. Now this, we'll talk about in a second, is really called your anatomical snuff box. Yes, it is. I bet you didn't know you had something on your body called a snuff box, but we'll get into that in a second. You got abductor pollicis longus, which is this nice tendon you can see right there. And your flexor pollicis longus right in here. Okay, Latin word for thumb, pollex. Okay, and our tendons, see if you can figure this out. The extensor pollicis brevis and the abductor pollicis longus, as they go across the wrist, they're going to cross a bone that's in the proximal row of carpals, and they're going to form a depression, which we're going to talk about in a second, directly over the most lateral bone in your first row of carpals, which is the scaphoid. Definitely want to know that. Okay, the depression there is called the anatomical snuff box, and as you might guess, it's because historically people that use tobacco would put it in that little space and inhale it through their nose. So there you go. All right, intrinsic muscles of the thumb, start and end on the hand. We got 4 more. So we have the abductor pollicis brevis, shorter muscle, flexor pollicis brevis, opponens pollicis, which creates opposition, and the adductor pollicis, okay? So really just know, okay, the abductor helps abduct the thumb. The flexor helps flex the thumb. The opponens does opposition. So luckily the name kind of helps with that. The adductor pollicis really also is involved in opposition to a good degree because you have to adduct the thumb in order to perform that movement. Okay, so if you put the bellies of all those guys together, we have this nice area, which you'll feel on your thumb right here, which we call the thenar eminence. So we have the hypothenar eminence, which is here on the pinky side. And then we have the thenar eminence, which is here on the thumb side. All right, so there's your abductor. There's your flexor. Okay, which is a good one. Opponens pollicis is kind of a cool muscle. It wraps around the wrist area. And then your adductor pollicis kind of starts from the middle finger and goes over into the thumb. So that's what brings your thumb towards your first finger. All right, and that'll be the end of the movements and muscles.